Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Heather Thompson, the author of Fear and Fury, the Reagan 80s, the Bernie Goetz shootings, and the rebirth of white rage. This is her fifth book, and she is a professor of history at the University of Michigan. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Thompson.
So great to be here.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Was it robbery? Was it an overreaction? Was it a case of self-defense or an instance of a shooter making their decision based on preconceived notions of who they were targeting? As I read the opening of this book, I couldn't help but think of the gaps that we see in so many controversial shootings between what people see or what they choose to see. The debate in my head felt a lot like the incident that we just saw in Minnesota, thanks to the convenience of video recorders, of course, in that case, from multiple angles. Another debate over whose rights were being trampled, the different sides becoming symbols of this larger struggle. So let's start there, Doctor. What was it like studying a case here in the year 2026 now, in 2025? I'm sure when you did a lot of the work on this. What was it like studying a case that did not have what so many incidents of today have, which is video of what happened?
Well, you would think that today having video would settle the matter, but
Oh,
actually
yeah,
I
everything's all settled. No one
got
debates anything anymore.
But I got interested in this project in no small part because of where we are today, which is, up is down, down is up. What you see with your eyes, you're told didn't happen. When there are particularly controversial clashes, we are given a narrative by some parties, see a narrative with our own eyes, and putting it all together has just become a complete jumble. And I wanted to kind of figure out how did we end up in this moment of really misinformation media, of people so divided over what would maybe decades ago have felt like relatively straightforward matters of right and wrong.
Did you feel jumbled, the word you used? Did you feel jumbled as you started to piece this together?
I did. I mean, in part because when you're a historian, as you know, you don't come at any project with a preconceived notion. You come with a lot of questions, and you have to actually start from the beginning. You start with the documents and the whatever footage there does exist. In this case of the 1980s, a lot of news footage and interviews and the confessions of the shooter in this story. And you have to kind of piece it all back together again. And I have to say that just like the book I did on Attica, there were moments when I was surprised by what I found and not exactly sure what to make of what I found. But the sum total of it was to really do a reconstruction. What happened blow by blow, not just on the subway between this one shooter and his four victims, but to me, even more interestingly, what happens thereafter in the court of public opinion and also, of course, into literal courtrooms. First a criminal trial and then a civil trial.
Before we go into to all of that, I want to just mention that AxelbankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and also a link to that Patreon page I mentioned. So definitely check out Nikki's work. Set the stage for us, Professor. Where was the debate over race and crime in New York before the moment those bullets were fired?
Well, that is in part what I needed to figure out. We have this narrative in our head that things were a complete mess in this country, essentially from the 1960s forward. And what historians have already figured out is that that is a very simplistic view of this period. In fact, things unfolded and changed pretty dramatically in subsequent decades, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. And that in many ways, the 60s were still very optimistic. It's one of the reasons why we saw so much protest. It's one of the reasons why things felt very heady. People had this idea that this country could be anything they wanted it to be. By the 70s, this starts to feel a little more tense, in no small part because there is a global recession that hits this country and every country really in its way. And finances are stretched, people are stretched. It is into that moment that steps a kind of new political order. And before we get into that, the upshot of that new political order is the 1980s. And the 1980s, for any of your listeners who remember it, was a pretty grim time. New York City, where this book is set, but it could have been Detroit, it could have been anywhere, right? Wherever you were in the 80s, it was grim. It was a feeling that public safety didn't exist, that there was nobody picking up the trash. There was schools were really suffering. Public resources were completely evaporating. Homelessness was on the rise. There was an AIDS crisis developing, and nobody was doing anything about it. And so, if you happened into New York City, either because you lived there or you were visiting in the 1980s, and you took the subway, your experience was tense. It was very it was ugly, there was a sense of danger everywhere you turn. What was interesting though is why that was, A, and B, how different people interpreted what was going on.
I was floored by some of this footage I was watching and getting ready for this. The subways looked terrible. I mean, at least in today's context, there was graffiti all over the place. There clearly was cars were in disrepair. And I remember a feeling of my own family, being slightly concerned. I mean, I was young, but slightly concerned about my dad coming back on the subway after dark. There was a feeling that I remember. I guess the end of the 1980s, I was 5, 6, 7 years old.
Mhm.
Was that feeling shared, almost universally, at least, by those who use the subways?
I think it was. And I can, I personally remember I was in graduate school at the time, and I remember coming into the city, and you would see families on the street, and you would go into the subway, and it was graffiti covered, and the lights would flicker on and off,
Yes.
and it was this at every subway hallway you just felt really grim, as I said. And I think everyone shared that feeling. And the thing was that the feeling of abandonment, which is really the what we're talking about, civic abandonment, was being was being caused. It wasn't a natural state for the city. Of course, that city had not looked like that in the 40s and in the 50s, and even into the 1960s. The city did not feel abandoned. And so the question is, what happened? And there was a certainly a pitch of what happened that blamed it on the thugs and the criminals and the people who were just unable to treat their fellow citizens with respect. But it was more complicated than that.
How did Ronald Reagan harness these feelings as this moment came into full view?
Well, that was one of the things that for me was so interesting. I was a child of the 80s. I remember the Reagan lore. This was a glamorous movie star who became president, and what he was selling was this kind of almost magical America. We were going to go back to the 1950s and to family values, and he was going to rescue this country from the particularly dark moment it was in at the end of the 1970s. Again, thanks to that global fiscal crisis. But what he was really about was a little bit more complicated. He was part of a tradition in the Republican Party in particular, but not exclusively, of quite wealthy people who were really interested in turning around the economic foundations that this country had been sitting on since the New Deal. And what that meant was they wanted much lower taxes for rich people, for businesses. They had long been trying to chip away at this kind of social safety net that the New Deal had created after the Great Depression. And they didn't like it because they had to pay their proportionate of share of taxes into it. And it was a steep tax burden, of course, as it is in all Western democracies with a social welfare state. And this was a moment of opportunity. You had a lot of racial conflict during the civil rights movement, so there was a lot of white people feeling nervous, resentful, a little under siege. You had this economic crisis. And what the Reagan Republicans were able to do was almost masterful. It was to kind of harness this racial anxiety and resentment. Meanwhile, of course, chipping away at this tax base, eroding social services. And what by doing that combination, I say it was brilliant because rather than people look at the shiny object, which was all of the dollars are leaving the public sector, they were looking at the result of it. Oh my God, there's so much crime. Subways look terrible. The streets have garbage in them. And they are being told that's not the problem of government's lack of interest in you. That's the problem with too much government. That's the problem with the criminal element. That's the problem with the dependent and lazy and criminal poor. And it is masterful because people really buy it. And they buy it in no small part because they are their own, particularly white people, their own racial anxieties are being pandered to, frankly.
Who was Bernie Goetz? And I'm really curious about his childhood. Of course, I want to know how he fit into this narrative you're talking about. But his childhood was interesting to me. His dad was stern, and he was clearly deeply troubled. How did that impact Bernie Goetz and his path towards this incident?
So Bernie Goetz is on the one hand an everyman, and I think that I try to make the case for the ways in which that is true. But it's also true that his own biography, as you note, his own personal growing up story is troubled. He comes from, as you say, a really stern immigrant German father. He comes from a quite wealthy family, actually, a very well-to-do family, but he's the youngest in the family, and he's clearly a loner. He's clearly someone who's internalized a lot of resentment and anger towards his own father. He is someone who has always felt misunderstood, not listened to, ignored. But it's not a story, in my view, of his own psychological profile, because he's also an everyman. He is the white guy who moves to the city, who expects the city to run a certain way. He expects efficiency in government. He expects the city streets to be clean. He doesn't want to look at an illegal drug trade. He doesn't want to see people suffering AIDS in the streets. He is discomfited by the abandonment he sees all around him. And he's angry about it and he wants to clean it up. And he can't understand why the government officials aren't doing what they need to do to clean it up. So, in that sense, he's very ordinary. He represents that still employed, still economically secure, but really feeling a little nervous and, again, under siege in the city.
He was a repairman, right? A electronics repairman living in his own apartment. I'm sorry, working in his own apartment and kind of traveling the subways for random gigs and getting about town to keep his livelihood together.
Yeah, I mean, he's highly educated. He went to NYU. He was, trained in engineering. And he has his own business that he runs out of his apartment, which of course makes sense. He's very much of a loner. He doesn't like to be around a lot of other people. But to just live in New York City, no matter who you are, anytime you're going to go somewhere, you got to take the subway. I mean, unless you're really quite wealthy and you can get around in a limo or in a taxi at all times, you're going to take the subway. And he lived, actually still lives, in
I
Greenwich
was
Village.
shocked to think about that he's just watching all this coverage about him for the last 50 years or 40
Yeah,
years.
exactly, exactly. Which, by the way, I think at some level he very much enjoys because it brings attention to the issues that he cares about, which is again the dysfunction in his view of government. But so he is out and about regularly in that very grim 80s that I'm telling you about. He is feeling that the streets need to clean up. But notably, and again, this is very typical to why he's that everyman, he doesn't see this problem as the problem of civic abandonment economically. He sees this problem as a problem, as he put it very pejoratively, of Black people and of Latinos and poor people in particular. So he sees this in a very racialized lens, and he is not shy, actually, to feel that he's going to say that and meanwhile try to bring some change in the city if he has to, all by himself.
The videos of him giving his depositions are extraordinary. He's like, darn right, I shot him. I had to shoot him. Who wouldn't have shot him in that case?
Exactly.
Barry Allen, Troy Canty, Darrell Cabey,
Maybe.
and James Ramseur. Who were they? I was particularly moved by your passages about the South Bronx, streets that I've been in and streets that I know. I'm not from that neighborhood, but still great to read about it. At really a different time or a different moment, as you put it. Who were those teenagers and what were they up to that day?
Well, let me just say that very question, who were those teenagers? I am embarrassed to say that when I began this book, I had no idea. And that really says everything, right? You have this major event where someone has shot four young men, and we don't even know at the time or in retrospect. We don't know their names. We don't know anything about them. So part of my journey in this book was I was determined to really tell their story too. These
Yeah, you
were
went back. I mean, you went back and figured out who they are and how they wound up in their apartments and their families and all that.
Yeah, so Darrell Cabey, who will become really the most important of the four in my book, because he is the one that Bernie Goetz will actually paralyze with the bullet when he shoots him. He ends up in public housing by a horrific fluke in his own family. He was from a family of boys. His mother and father were married. They live in Rockaway, Queens. They have a relatively modest but stable family life, and his father is killed. His father is actually carjacked for his truck that he uses for work, and he's killed in the process of that violent crime. And because of this, his family moves to public housing, where he meets eventually all these other boys who become his friends. And the thing is, the South Bronx has experienced this abandonment of the 80s even more palpable, even more powerfully than what Bernie Goetz is seeing in Greenwich Village, because these are people who are dependent on subsidized rent in the city. They need public schools. They need resources if your kid has a learning disability. They need public parks. They need job opportunities. They need, for example, the public job opportunities that used to exist. They were called CETA jobs, CETA, and that's a perfect example of something that the Reagan administration immediately just decimates. So there's no jobs for these kids. There are very few resources, very little opportunity, and everywhere they turn is a growing illegal drug trade, because, of course, that's how people are going to have to make ends meet, and a lot of violence that always accompanies an illegal market. And these are kids who are just trying to make it. So their plan is that they're going to go into the city of Manhattan 3 days before Christmas, And they're going to go to a local arcade and they're going to jimmy open some video arcade machines because this is a very kind of non-violent, but certainly effective way for young people to have gotten a few coins back in the day. And that's what they were going to do that fateful Saturday.
And they admitted to that. I mean, they told police that and court officials clearly, right?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, the thing is that they were never actually ones to obscure both what they were doing and also, perhaps most significantly, take responsibility for it, right? Admit that this was not the best path forward, but also kind of express their own measure of displacement and feeling of what are our choices.
Go through the incident itself. As I mentioned, we don't have video. We've had to
Yeah.
reconstruct it based on their own statements, and a lot of this is not even contested, frankly, between the two of them. There is a point where the stories and the intentions diverge, but what do we absolutely know about what happened on that subway car?
Right. Well, we know that these four get on the subway up in the Bronx and they are headed downtown on the 2 train. And they are, they are teenagers. They are fooling around. They're swinging from the straps. They're joshing each other. They're loud. They're boisterous. When someone gets on, they're like, hey, what's up? Do you have a light? What's going on? Very, very loud, which I'm sure for many of the passengers was unnerving. Anytime you see a crowd of teenagers, you're going to feel a little unnerved, particularly in this moment in the 80s. But people don't, by and large, they just ignore them. No one's feeling like they got to get off the train or move to the next car. At 14th Street, Bernie gets on that car too. And he is frustrated that day. He's had a bad morning working on his electronics equipment, and he's, going to go out. He's going to get out of his apartment for a while. He gets on this train and he sits directly across from at least two of the boys who are again fooling around. And one of them, Troy Canty, says, hey, hi, basically greets him. And kind of encouraged because it returns the greeting, albeit a bit tersely. He says, hey, you have $5. And we had to pause there because, of course, this is panhandling. And panhandling had also become absolutely commonplace in the 80s New York. Very, by the way, very irritating, of course, and very unsettling, but also very common. And Troy Canty's thinking is, we're going to go into this video arcade, and if we don't have any money in our pocket, we're not going to be very plausible being in there. So maybe this guy will give me $5. And Bernie gets stands, and he turns. Troy Canty thinks that he's going to give him some money, but within mere seconds, he has reached into a hidden holster in his waistband. He's pulled out a .38 Smith & Wesson. He turns, assumes a combat stance, and immediately shoots Troy in the chest. Behind him is his friend Barry Allen, who turns in horror to get away. He shoots him in the back. And then farther down the train are the two other young men, Darrell Cabey and James Ramseur, who he then shoots, hitting James Ramseur through the arm, which then the bullet pierces his lungs. But he misses Darrell Cabey. And this is where things get really interesting.
So just stop you real quick. So how much of that is in dispute? Almost none of it.
There is nothing in dispute that he shot these young men. What is in dispute, or what later will be in dispute because he gets a really fabulous lawyer, is what these young men were doing prior to being shot and whether or not he shot Darrell Cabey 2 times, meaning the second shot deliberately. At least for the
Sorry, so go
past.
ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
KB turns and walks. Yeah.
So Ramseur tries to run. He gets shot. So all three of the four are shot, but he misses Darrell Cabey, who at this point is down at the end of the train. He is seated on a bench. He is quaking. He is terrified. Bernie Goetz walks over to him. And by the way, one of the passengers on the train sees this very, very clearly, walks over to him, looks down at him, and says, you look all right, here's another, and shoots him point blank range, severing his spinal cord. And then into this chaotic, horrific scene where the passengers are stunned, trying to get out of there, running, some of them frozen, some of them on the ground, playing dead. He, Bernie Goetz, eventually will jump off that train, disappear into the tunnels, be on the lam for almost 2 weeks, and no one knows who he is, but he is already almost overnight becoming a media celebrity, a Charles Bronson death wish vigilante that so many New Yorkers wish they themselves had the guts to be.
I was kind of floored because I watched a little bit of the media coverage. Maybe you watched some of the same stories that were done. I'm sure you did actually. And the people who they interviewed, the first couple of people who were on the news stories were African American, and they both said, darn right, he should have shot them. And other people, some of them were white, said, no way he should have shot them. So, what can we take away from the media coverage? What was the media coverage like in the aftermath?
Well, that became for me the other just kind of surprising but super interesting part of the story. If you look at some of the coverage, as you mentioned, you would get the impression that, that race has nothing to do with people's reaction to this. Some white people condemned it, a lot of black people thought he was a hero. So I was like intrigued by that because there was just something about this that just did not really ring true to me. So I started to really dig. I started to dig into the black newspapers, into the tabloids at the time, which I'll tell you about in a second because this is part of the interesting part of the story. The papers of record, like the New York Times. And what quickly becomes clear is that this is not quite that simple. There are certainly progressive whites that are horrified by what happened, and they will come out against Bernie Goetz. But overwhelmingly, his support is coming from particularly working class white New Yorkers, although not exclusively, including white politicians, particularly wealthy white New Yorkers. And they are fully in his camp. The black community is overwhelmingly actually horrified by what's happened because it's not that they're not being victimized by crime. They are. It's not that they're not also afraid on the subway. They are. But they are very alarmed by this idea that some white guy who feels threatened can just gun down what is in effect their own children, right? Without provocation. So this will become very racialized. And the reason why the one narrative of him being a hero and the narrative of he is in fact the victim and these young men are in fact the villains is curated. And it is curated by the New York tabloid media. And specifically, this is super interesting for, I think, contemporary listeners. Uh, Curated by Rupert Murdoch's New York Post. Rupert Murdoch, who will go on to be the father of Fox News, he wants to make a mark in the United States. He wants his conservative message and his media outlets to dominate in New York and the United States. And this case is going to be his holy grail. He is going to be able to run with the coverage of this case and at every opportunity spin it in such a way that Bernie Goetz is the hero and these young men are the animals, the thugs, the ones who should be behind bars.
Is there ever a claim made by Bernie Goetz or Bernie Goetz's attorney that any of the four teenagers had tried to make an offensive attack against him in the way that George Martin claimed that Trayvon Martin attacked him?
So there's actually some eerie similarities with the Trayvon Martin case because even George Zimmerman's testimony about what was exactly threatening about Trayvon Martin was kind of emotional, right? Psychological, not clear that he's actually going to be physically harmed. And then of course that story for him will also change. But in any case, initially, in this case, Bernie Goetz, when he finally turns himself in and people finally know who he is, he gives a confession. And he says very clearly on this confession, robbery has nothing to do with this. and then he's asked again and again and again, did he'd been mugged, by the way, earlier in New York City in 1981. Did this previous mugging have anything to do with it? And he just kind of explodes and he says, look, robbery had nothing to do with it. That previous mugging had nothing to do with it. I didn't like the gleam in Troy Canty's eyes. He felt that these young men were up to no good. He felt that he was threatened in the sense that he didn't know what they may or may not do. But he was really clear that he was going to essentially stop whatever this may be before it became anything. As he said, he wanted to kill them all. If he would have had more bullets, he would have succeeded in killing them all. And he had a remarkable lack of really not just remorse, but even really even feeling the need to explain what he had done.
I want to ask about you a little bit here and how you put this all together. You're from Detroit.
Mhm.
I'm curious, a fascinating city. My wife and I were just there maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Well, actually less, maybe 3 years ago. And we loved it. A beautiful city, amazing city. And they've experienced everything. They've had a little bit
Right.
of high achievement. They've had some difficult times. They've had corruption. They've had racial strife. How did being from Detroit and the experience you have there help keep your eyes open as you explored this particular incident?
Well, my own biography, there's no question, shapes who I am as a historian and how I research and how I write. I grew up in the city of Detroit in the 70s and really constantly came back into the 80s. And Detroit was in terrible shape in this period as well. But Detroit was slightly different in that there had been a wholesale abandonment of the city by white Detroiters. They had all fled for the suburbs. And I was one of the very few remaining white Detroiters in the city. I went to a mostly black high school. I grew up in a mostly black neighborhood, grew up, socialized, was really identified with a mostly black community. And so for me growing up, this idea that cities were the dropping off point if they were black led or they were majority black just never rung true. I could see the economic abandonment of the 80s in my city. I could see the strife. I could see the costs of the drug war. I could see the problem with crime. But I could also see the abandonment and where it was coming from, right? I watched as our programs dried up and I could see the causes a little more clearly, I think. So for me, anytime I write, whether it's about prisoners at Attica or whether it's in this story about these teenagers, I'm always very acutely aware that whatever the media is telling you, right? Like Detroit is just the murder capital of the world and that's all you need to know, that there is a very complex story behind that, both of the people who actually live there and also the reasons why these places look the way they do.
Are there similar incidents in Detroit history?
Of course. I mean, of course, there are vicious incidents of white violence in the city of Detroit, some of which I mention actually in this book, and also terrible, terrible problems with police brutality in the city. My first book actually talks a lot about that. And so, of course, and mostly what is similar though is this media narrative that when bad things happen to poor Black people, it is largely because of their own social and cultural dysfunction. And that, out of all of the kind of messages coming at me, at least as a teenager, just was so objectionable, so really anti-historical. When I could see from my own eyes that the bulk of that kind of violence and hostility was actually coming from my white friends, right? It was coming from my own, extended family, right? I understood the way racism worked, I think, a little differently as a white person living in a black city.
What sources did you use to put this all together?
Oh my goodness. Well, the other thing about when you want to rescue these kinds of stories is it's really difficult to just go to the archive and say, let me pull box 15 and look at folder 12.
Right, right.
Uh,
Bernhard Goetz doesn't necessarily have his papers
yeah.
for public consumption.
And of course, nor do his victims. And so the good news about this book was that there is the entire trial record preserved in the papers of the judges, and that was hugely helpful to me. But really, I had to do with this book as I did with Blood in the Water. I just had to kind of stop, think who might have a copy, who might have something relevant to what happened in this moment. So calling together, excuse me, my dog, of course, every time I try to talk to
That's the
someone
way
on
they
it.
are. Yeah.
Calling together newspaper reports, talking to the attorneys about the cases from the point of view of those who actually tried to represent the young men. So the legal record, interviews, newspaper accounts, probation reports from Bernie Goetz himself. That ended up being an incredibly important resource to me to really understand him. Reports from the Crime Victims Bureau of New York, which I found fascinating. Here's an entire bureau set up and really newly funded by the Reagan administration. It existed, but Reagan puts more money in it because he's all about the victims of crime. And every one of these young men, well, actually not every one of them, at least two of these young men tried to get funding from the Crime Victims Bureau, and they're all denied. Even though they are the ones in ICUs, they are the ones shot. One of them is paralyzed, but they are decided to not actually be the victims. And I just found that just fascinating. And I wouldn't have seen that dynamic without kind of digging into these crime victim files.
How did this story and this idea for you flow out of your previous book on the Attica uprising?
I think the research, right? The approach to the book. Attica is a very different story, but what is similar about it is in that case, a whole group of prisoners fighting for civil rights end up getting killed and gunned down, and it turns out that the story of how that happened was covered up. It wasn't what America thought it was. So in that sense, this book is similar. I'm always trying to figure out what was happening behind the headlines and from the point of view of the victims of the story. But in a lot of other ways, it was very, very different because I was coming at stuff I hadn't really looked at before, digging into the kind of rise of the conservative media, for example, or looking more closely at how this plays out in a city that is got lots of different moving parts and that is the home ultimately of men like Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani and all these people who are going to run with this moment and really capitalize on that white anger and resentment that this lays the groundwork for.
So let's talk about the impact. He is caught, or I shouldn't say he's caught. He walks in 9 days later and says, "It's me who you're looking for." How did the political debate start to change once people um, got a sense of who Bernie Goetz was and what his complaints were?
Well, this is where media stories saying that he is the victim become essential to people's decision immediately before he ever even stands trial, that he shouldn't stand trial, and that if he does, he should be vindicated. But what is really kind of at the heart of this book is a trial story. If any of your listeners like kind of true crime and courtroom dramas, this one has, I think, it all, which is Bernie Goetz is represented by a guy named Barry Slotnick, and Barry Slotnick was, I mean, he's brilliant. He is a mob lawyer, very, nattily dressed, a showman, and he represents Bernie Goetz. And of course, the state prosecutor is this kind of nerdy Clark Kent type, and by no means as flashy as Barry Slotnick. And Barry Slotnick literally takes this case and makes up, down, down, up. What you think you're seeing, you're not seeing. It is quite extraordinary. And at the end of the day, Bernie Goetz is basically utterly vindicated by a jury, incidentally, who can see a story that they don't actually end up believing. They actually are told, don't even believe Bernie Goetz's own confession. And that is going to matter to the future of America. Bernie Goetz is in bankrolled by the National Rifle Association, who sees this as an opportunity to come north. He is supported ultimately by people like Rudy Giuliani, who failed to uh, file a civil rights case on behalf of the young men he shot, and so forth and so on, so that uh, the groundwork is then laid for a couple of things. One, a rise in white violence. This is when we get white mob teenagers going after black teenagers in Howard Beach and horrible incidents like in Bensonhurst. This is gives a green light for the passage of all kinds of laws, like the Stand Your Ground laws. Speaking of Trayvon
That was
Martin.
actually my next question about stand your
Yeah.
ground laws.
Yeah, this is really important to the Stand Your Ground laws. When he wins, this is a message to the NRA. Let's start really bankrolling these legal cases to allow people to carry guns and use them as essentially use them as they want to.
And the only
Um,
thing that he's found guilty of is the carrying of a weapon that he was not allowed to carry in the first
right.
place.
That's right, carrying an illegal weapon. And this is stunning, given not just what he admitted to, not just what the passengers on the train themselves testified to, but given the injuries that these young men clearly had.
What did the passengers on the train think? Did the passengers on the train believe that this was unjustified?
I mean, certainly the testimony indicates that they were not feeling threatened themselves. They could not understand what had just happened. They could not figure out why this man had just shot these teenagers, and they were horrified. They were appalled. And certainly for the witness that saw him target Darrell Cabey, that was a horrific image that it was impossible for him to really to kind of live with. It was a horrible moment, and so there was only one group that just it didn't matter what the witnesses said. It didn't matter what he confessed to. They believed that he had a right to do what he did, and that was so deeply racialized. And if anyone doubts it, one just needs to look at the coverage. The hate mail, as you may recall from the book, that comes into these young teenagers, even when they're in the hospital, the threats are so racialized. The coverage is so racialized. And this again cements this idea that what's wrong with cities is black people.
What happened to the teenagers? Obviously, Darrell Cabey is living very much with what happened. He's
Yeah.
paralyzed. What about the other three? And were you able to reach them?
So interesting. No, I ended up not talking. I ended up not being able to talk with the victims. In no small, two of them are no longer alive. Darrell Cabey has suffered serious brain damage as a result of a coma that he slipped in after he was shot. And the other victim, Troy Canty, doesn't want to talk to any reporters. He is so, or I would assume journalists and historians, he is so traumatized by the coverage of that whole event that he doesn't trust anyone to tell his story, and he wants to live a peaceful life away from all this. But that said, the fallout on these youngsters was horrific. One of them is paralyzed, as we've mentioned. Another one, his life completely falls apart. He ends up being accused of a quite serious crime and ends up doing time in prison. He ends up killing himself on the anniversary of the shooting. Another one descends into drug addiction, will also do time in prison and die very young from poor health. And again, the only one that manages to kind of repair his life in any kind of way is Troy Canty, and he is now living, as is Darrell Cabey, away from New York City, trying to still undoubtedly trying to recover from this.
Bernie Goetz, he's alive. Do we know? Did you try to reach him? I mean, I kind of envision reporters standing outside, or a historian, a hopeful one like yourself, standing outside his building to try to wait for him to come outside. I mean, everyone's got to come outside eventually. How much of an effort did you make to talk to him?
So it's very interesting because when I first began the project, I'm a historian, so I don't usually tend to do kind of contemporary interviews with people unless the whole book is going to be really committed to oral history. So I decided I wanted to have conversations with all of the key players if I could. And initially I reached out to Goetz not just once, but actually twice while I was also reaching out to the young men. And not a word, not a peep from Goetz to speak with me. And then I discovered the reasons why the young men could not speak to me who were still alive. And then I decided I actually didn't want to talk to Goetz because I felt like that would kind of be an imbalanced approach to the book. But it is interesting. There is another book on Bernie Goetz out right now, and he did talk to that author. Bernie Goetz does not like women very much, which is another thing that came through very clearly in this book. He absolutely detested the female DA that first questions him. And, I have no idea why he didn't talk to me, but I think it was in no small part because he does not like to share the story with women.
What do you believe are the most essential questions he must answer? What did you
Um,
want to ask him?
As if I'm gonna have a conversation with anybody who's been a player in a story, I just ask them to tell me the story as they saw it, and I always try to honor people's own perspective, and so I just wanted to listen to that from all of them. But I have no ambivalence, frankly, by the story that I end up telling with the story that I end up telling in the book, because the thing about history is that it does leave a very large footprint. Maybe sometimes it's a bit obscured. Maybe sometimes it's hard to actually see what happened. But when you actually look, people tell you who they are. They say what they mean. They do what they say they're going to do. You just have to find those records and find those documents and see what that was at the time. And he was very clear at the time, and even well past that time, much later years. I believe the most recent interview he gave when Kyle Rittenhouse shot people and was acquitted, and then again when Daniel Penny, a case of another subway vigilante, he is highly supportive of vigilantism, highly defensive to this day of what he did. And, he later went on to say that he thinks that Darrell Cabey's mother, Shirley, a hardworking woman who spent her remaining days taking care of her son, that she should have had an abortion and never even had him. I mean, this is a man who is very, very hard to try to but he's certainly one that we can try to understand the context within which he did what he did.
Give us some advice. Um, how should we approach new incidents that bring up these types of debates so that we can react in responsible, um, not necessarily emotionally, and then also to weigh in on them and on our public forums, whether it's social media or with our friends or what have you. How should we react to these kinds of incidents that bring up these huge debates in ways that help people as opposed to hurting people?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one that I don't have the perfect answer for, but it's one I think about a lot. I mean, I think the core issue always, when you see horrible things play out on the ground and you see crime and you see victims and victimization, it is our responsibility to ask what is the context within which that happened, not to excuse it, not to have any less of a desire for people to take responsibility for what they did, but because somewhere in there is an explanation. There are very few people who are just pure psychopaths, people whose brains just do not have empathy and so forth. So most incidents of harm and ugliness are coming because people are feeling a sense of abandonment, displacement, anxiety, and the question is why. We need a society where people feel secure and where people feel that the needs of the public are met. And so peel behind those easy answers that people are just thugs or animals and figure out what's going on, because that's actually where our task lies, to create a society like many others that do exist in the world, with far less of this pain being played out on the ground on a daily basis.
Do you remember following this in the first place? I think you said you were in grad school around the time. Do you remember hearing about this for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't follow it, but I absolutely remember when it happened. And and again, that's my own kind of embarrassed confession that I never blinked. I never thought, well, why in the world would he have done that? I'd been into the subways, I had seen the condition of them, and I, in my own way, even coming from Detroit as I did, had, uh, been less critical of the media stories that I heard. I mean, the media tells everyone these young men are carrying sharpened screwdrivers. It was a lie. They weren't. But I never questioned it. And so that's one of the reasons I became a historian. I feel like not it's not that you can't trust the media. I mean, I'm not one of those people. It's more that every story has multiple angles to it, and it is our responsibility to figure out the full story before we act, particularly in acts of rage and racial rage in particular.
What projects are you working on right now? I was looking at your site. You've got a book on the move bonding. I'm sorry,
Bombing.
move bombing.
Yeah.
Um, and Attica was also optioned. That's kind of exciting.
Yeah, well, so it was going to be a major motion picture, and we've actually decided we're pulling it back. We're going to actually try to take it out now as a series because we think it would be work better as that. I mean, and to me, any way we can share history with the public, I'm super excited about. So yeah, just finished Fear and Fury, and the other book that I'm writing is on a police bombing of a organization in Philadelphia called Move. Another kind of dramatic, big story of the 80s. I'm all done researching it, halfway done writing it, but that'll be the next book.
What can we all learn from your efforts of teaching African American history as a white woman?
That white people have a responsibility to tell the truth about about white people and about, the conversations that go on at Thanksgiving dinner tables, and that, that the assumptions that white people make all the time about the world and the privileges that they have, and that, if racism is ever going to end, it has to be on the backs of white people to figure out their role in it. And I think that, we always invert that. We always say, but how, it's on the civil rights movement to be stronger. It's on black people to demand their fair due. No, it's actually on white people to reckon with their own long history of this, and constant buying into narratives where everything that they have is because they earned it, deserve it, and everybody else that doesn't have it, it's because they're lazy and didn't deserve it.
Your dedication is to two people, Frank Wilson Thompson Jr. You say, I miss you every single day. And then the next one is to Dash Callahan Herb. With you, we can now imagine the future. Who are those two folks, and why did you dedicate the books to them? The book to them.
So the first is my father, who died in 2021, and still very much with us, and still grieving that tremendously. But as this book was going to press, my first grandson was born, and that is Dash. And I am, yeah, it's made 2026, despite all that we see every day on the news, at least for our family and for me, really hopeful.
How do you think being a grandparent changes you as opposed to just being a parent?
I just like when you have your first children, it's just uncanny. You lay your eyes on this human being the first time, and you're like, pure love. it's really amazing. But also, it's funny because now that I'm older, I also now see a baby, and it also just makes me feel even more responsibility for, our generation. I mean, we have a lot to account for, but we also have a lot to do to leave a better world for all of those young people, whether we are their parents or their grandparents or their neighbors or anybody else.
Dr. Heather Ann Thompson, the author of Fear and Fury, the Reagan 80s, the Bernie Goetz shootings, and the rebirth of white rage. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Check out the book and also her website, which is heatheranthompson.com. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. AxelBankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes on it, our featured episodes, and also a link to that Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.